Hundreds of tons of heavy Russian metal has crossed into Ukraine today. How will the West respond? We're expecting to hear from Boris Johnson addressing MPs in the House of Commons with details of British sanctions in the next few minutes or next half an hour, we expect. But also Joe Biden, America's president, expected to address that question as well. Let's ponder on what he might say in the company of the former American National Security Advisor, John Bolton, who joins me now. Mr. Bolton, thanks for your time, as ever. We do appreciate it. I was explaining to a couple of younger colleagues this morning how the peace dividend that we enjoyed 40 years ago, some people treated it as if it was a permanent feature of life, but actually some wise old hawks rather suspected it wouldn't be. I wonder, thinking back 40 years, thinking back even further to the Ronald Reagan White House, what he would have done on a day like this, do you think?
Well, I think the first thing to keep in mind is that today represents a failure of the West effort to prevent a Russian invasion of Ukraine. The whole point of the policy, at least that's what we were told, was to create deterrence that would persuade Putin that the costs of invading were much greater than the potential benefits, and that has failed. So the question now is what you do in the wake of that failure to try and make the lesson plain, if not to Putin in the Ukraine, to Putin in other circumstances, to Xi Jinping and other threats around the world. And I certainly hope that the U.S., the U.K., the European Union, and others really do impose the strictest, harshest sanctions they can. Because if they fail to do that, Putin won't learn the right lesson, and neither will others. This is not a case now of a successful policy in Ukraine if the sanctions are strong. It's the reflection that the policy has failed. But to try and establish or reestablish the credibility of U.S. and Western threats against further potential aggression.
Time about what's happening in Taiwanese airspace today. Chinese jets, by seeming coincidence, seem to be buzzing Taiwanese airspace today. What an extraordinary coincidence that is. But just in terms of that failure, John Bolton, what could the West have done? There are limits on sanctions. There are limits on the damage that we could have done to the Russian economy to sufficiently deter Putin in this mood. The next option becomes military. What could we possibly have done?
Well, the question today is like saying on the 21st move of a chess game, what would you do now when the last 15 moves have been inadequate? Yeah. From the U.S. perspective, but I think this is important for the U.K. in particular, but for continental Europe as well. It was our conclusion in 1945 that we collectively needed to guarantee peace and security and stability in Europe, and that led a few years later to NATO. But NATO's premise is not, we protect NATO and we don't really care what happens anywhere else. That's not the premise, because peace and security for NATO members may depend on what happens next door. And frankly, we should have made Ukraine, we should have put it on the path to NATO membership in 2008 when George W. Bush proposed it. France and Germany blocked it. We're paying for that now. But let's consider, Finland's not a NATO member either. Do we, particularly care what Russia does to them? This is a very painful lesson in narrow-mindedness, and that's why imposing the harshest sanctions we can is critical, not just to damage Russia, but to repair our own credibility.
You put it in a nuanced way, in a sense, John Bolton, that idea of there being so many chess moves and it's impossible to say there was one mistake and one mistake alone. We sort of get that. In terms of what we do now within the context of NATO, we look at the German response. I think it was 5,000 helmets they sent to Ukraine and weren't particularly keen on us using their airspace to fly in anti-tank weapons. So there are divisions within Europe, within NATO, it seems, as to how to respond. I just wonder, can you sum it up today for us? I know it's difficult, but the sense of historic gravity, is this the recommencement of the Cold War? Is this the beginning of Cold War 2.0 starting today?
Well, I don't like to use old names because the next thing you know, somebody will say we need another Marshall Plan. It's a different world, but the threat that's being manifested is one that we feel not only in Europe, but in the Indo-Pacific as well. I wrote last week in the Wall Street Journal about the entente that we now see between Russia and China. This is real. It could grow to be an alliance or even an axis if we're not careful. I think one thing that people should learn in light of the Ukraine experience is that the so-called rules-based international order doesn't exist. Vladimir Putin didn't get the memo. I don't think Xi Jinping has opened his copies either. And the more we talk about it, the more we live in fantasy land. Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher understood that you achieve peace through strength. As the Romans said, si vis pacem para bellum. It's still true today. And it's fantasy. And you said earlier, remember the famous peace dividend, which we have suffered from ever since. So it's not pleasant to think about, but if we truly want peace and stability and security, and certainly we do, we have to be prepared to defend it. And our threats have to be credible, which they are not today in too many cases.
To be credible, John Bolton, they've got to be paid for. We think back to the Thatcher-Reagan years where, to some degree, we just outspent the Warsaw Pact. You mentioned the Marshall Plan in those years, the decades after World War II. In today's money, trillions spent bolstering the faltering states of Eastern Europe. Are we prepared to spend the sums necessary? Are we prepared to send tens of thousands of young men and women to freshly garrison new army bases in Eastern Europe?
No, I don't think we're ready for that yet, because certainly, just speaking for the United States, we've had years of politicians acting like the world is not a threatening place. You can go back just to 2014 when Putin last invaded Ukraine and annexed the Crimea and established these so-called separatist regimes in the Donbass. And neither the Obama administration nor Europe really did much of anything. So it's a little wonder that Putin's own personal experience shows no credibility. And he also saw the catastrophic U.S. withdrawal with NATO from Afghanistan this summer. People say they're tired of endless wars. And now the United States, by the testimony of Biden administration officials, faces a renewed terrorist threat from Afghanistan, which didn't exist until we pulled out. So I think political leaders have an obligation to explain the world to their constituents, and you have to make the case in a democratic society why strength protects you. It doesn't make you more endangered. You know, it's not, as Donald Rumsfeld used to say, it's not strength that's provocative, it's weakness that's provocative.
John Bolton, just hold that thought if you wouldn't mind for one more question. I'm just reading, it's literally our friends at the Press Association just reporting that the FTSE 100, our main bourse, our main index, biggest one-day fall in, actually, since June 2020. It's down 3.9%. I suppose some people might say it could possibly be worse. John Bolton, before we let you go, I just wonder if you'll just reprise that idea you floated a moment ago about China. It will feel to a lot of people that the penny hasn't fully dropped yet, that this is, if not an alliance or an axis, as you suggest, then a really chilling international development, a willingness of Xi Jinping to support Vladimir Putin and provide him with cover, and a shared sense of geopolitical destiny.
Yeah, look, I think, in effect, they've been doing it in some respects for a long time, but it's one reason I look at it for now as an entente. They are covering each other's backs. Russia has predominant interest in Europe. China has predominant interest in the Indo-Pacific. They both have an interest in the Middle East. The idea that you can ignore one or the other, or that there are no threats visible, is just wrong. And I think when people like Emmanuel Macron talking about the security structure of Europe, I think Europe as a whole has to think of the rest of the world too, and because it is all connected.
John Bolton is a former national security advisor and a former US ambassador to the United Nations as well, much else besides. John Bolton, thanks very much indeed for your thoughts today.